For many architectural photographers, the widest angle tilt shift lens for a while now has been the 17mm from Canon, and this lens is brilliant for a number of reasons. Recently, a company called Laowa released the 15mm shift lens, and in this video, I'm going to compare the two to see which one is better. Okay, so let's quickly run through the specifications and design between both of these lenses. So the biggest immediate difference you're going to notice is the fact that this is about half the price of the Canon, lighter and smaller than the Canon as well, albeit with a slightly smaller aperture. But the difference between f4.5 and f4 isn't that much, especially when you consider the fact that most people are going to be stopping these lenses down anyway to around f8 or f11, depending on what you're shooting. Now, the Canon is a tilt and shift lens, meaning that you can tilt the lens with the front section of the lens, and you can also shift the back of the lens as well. The Laowa, however, is just a shift lens, so just the back portion of the lens is going to shift. So if you need those tilting features, the Canon is obviously going to be the better option. But for architectural photographers, I'm not certain that the tilt features are going to be extremely useful. In terms of build and construction, the Laowa is extremely well made. The focus ring, extremely smooth. The aperture ring really feels nice. Construction, solid metal. They both feel extremely good. However, what I find is that the Canon focus ring is just a little bit more comfortable to use because it's got that rubber. It's got that rubberized finish. It just feels a little bit nicer in the hand, whereas the Laowa feels a little bit harsher in the hand, especially after prolonged use. However, there is one thing that I really like about the Laowa, and that is that the focus ring has a much longer throw in comparison to the Canon, which is quite a small focus throw, and that means that focusing more precisely with the Laowa is far more effective. It's a little bit easier to focus more precisely with the Laowa than it is with the Canon. In my uses, I find that getting that precise focus is just a little bit tricky with the Canon. However, in terms of build and design, I mean, obviously the Canon is fantastic and really well made, but the Laowa, surprisingly, it's really well constructed, and I don't think anyone's going to be displeased about that. One of the things that I found really annoying about the Laowa lens on the Canon 5DSR was that exposure stimulation for some reason just didn't work. So whatever I was seeing on the back of the camera in live view wasn't the exposure that I get once I take the shot. The metering was working fine, but the live view exposure stimulation just didn't work. And what this meant was that when I wanted to focus correctly, I couldn't see on the back of the camera if the exposure was correctly set based on the shutter speed and so on. This was obviously not a problem with the 17 tilt shift on the Canon 5DSR, but for some reason with the Laowa it just didn't want to work. So between both of these lenses, when it comes to the focal length, the difference is only 2mm. However, on the wider end, those 2mm makes a very noticeable difference, and the Laowa lens is going to have a noticeably wider field of view in comparison to the 17 tilt shift, especially when you start shifting the lens. And this is going to be useful for a lot of photographers because you're going to be able to get far more in the frame compared to the 17, especially if you're a Nikon photographer, because for a Nikon photographers, the widest tilt shift lens was a 19mm, so going from 15 to 19mm is going to give you a significant difference. Now, with Laowa lenses, a lot of Laowa lenses that I've shot with, one of the key issues has been color. Laowa lenses have always had this like a yellowy orange color shift to them, and this is something that I don't really particularly like about them. And the Canon 17 tilt shift has always been really good when it comes to producing neutral, good looking colors. Unfortunately, the 15 shift lens still has this color shift, and when you start looking at images side by side at the same white balance, the Canon does a much better job. And this is quite an important feature because for a lot of architectural photographers, color accuracy is important. For example, the DoubleTree building or the hotel, it's not an orange building, and the Laowa lens, that shift is causing that problem. That warm shift isn't really a great look. However, with white balancing and some color correction, you could fix it, especially if you use something like a color checker passport. When it comes to image quality, there are some notable differences between both lenses, and now that we have all of the images opened up in Lightroom, we can start to take a closer look at each of the files. For this first comparison, I just want to take a look at the field of view differences once again, and we can see them more effectively here, that even though the difference is only 2mm, the Laowa is picking up more in the frame, both on the edges and on the top of the image. And this can be extremely useful for architectural photographers who are shooting outside, cityscapes, or if you're shooting high rises relatively close. Those 2mm can sometimes make all the difference. Another point I wanted to cover was how flaring affects both of these lenses. So here's the thing, the Laowa lens is quite a bit sharper than the 17 tilt shift, even on the edges of the frame. Center sharpness about the same, we're going to be looking at it anyway, but it's the edges where the Laowa really makes the difference. And in most circumstances, the Laowa is sharper. However, in bright, sunny conditions, the flaring and the internal reflections really cause problems for the Laowa. Like look at the center over here. Both lenses have been focused correctly in the middle over here, and the Canon looks more defined. Even though the flaring is running across the frame, the Laowa has more of an issue with flaring because it goes all the way through the lens and comes back out over here on this side. With the Canon controls flaring far more effectively, and even at f8, the flares are much rounder in comparison to the Laowa. So look at the center over here. First of all, colors are a little bit different. White balance is exactly the same camera that I'm shooting with, Canon 5 DSR. And you can see how the contrast has really been reduced on the Laowa lens, and there's this certain haziness. Like look at the text, look at the lettering over here on this building, and look at the lettering over here. And the Laowa is just a little bit hazy in comparison, because of the way that the internal reflections are affecting the lens. Even in this comparison over here, you can see how the flares in the Canon are rounder, and the Laowa, it goes all the way through the lens and comes out on the other side, whereas the Canon controls it far more effectively. So bright conditions, little bit of a problem for the Laowa lens, and that haziness really does affect the image in my view. On this one, you know, the lighting wasn't changing, but for some reason the Canon seems a bit brighter. Like in a lot of tests, in a lot of images that I've shot, the Canon always seems to be about almost half a stop brighter at any given exposure in comparison to the Laowa. So I think the t-stop values might be a little bit off on the Laowa lens. However, the flaring I think is going to cause quite a bit of problem, quite a few problems for a lot of photographers. Now look at the edge over here, and look at the edge over here, and look at how the light kind of comes all the way through, comes out the other side, but the Canon controls it far more effectively. Now the internal reflections is the biggest problem for the Laowa lens, and the reason for this is because even though the Laowa is a sharper lens in comparison to the Canon, and I'm going to show you how and why it is a sharper lens compared to the Canon, but in bright conditions, you know, the internal reflections causes a bunch of problems for the lens, because when you zoom in, like over here, this picture that I've taken, you can see how the Canon looks sharper, like it looks more defined. Look at the brickwork, look how much more defined the Canon looks in comparison to the Laowa. And focus has been accurately achieved. You can see that it's in focus. You know, they're both shot at f8, so they both have a great deal of depth of field, especially the 15mm, same distance away from the building. And the haziness from the internal reflections causing a lot of problems, and it's reducing a great deal of that contrast. And because of that, the Canon looks sharper, it looks more detailed, when actually the Laowa is the sharper lens. Now if you shoot a scene in flat lighting conditions where there aren't any harsh lights or sunlight hitting and causing internal reflections, you'll notice how much sharper the Laowa lens will look. So in the center you can see that there isn't a great deal of difference, although the Laowa does look a little bit sharper, especially when you're looking at some of the text over here. But the difference is so minor that I don't think anyone's really going to notice it. However, it's the edges of the frame. Like if we start moving towards the edges, like look at the lettering over here, the Canon is definitely softer. It's losing a great deal of detail on the edges of the frame. Even on this side over here, look at how much sharper the Laowa, is in comparison to the Canon. Now both of these lenses have been shifted all the way up and relatively close, and you can see that in that circumstance the 15mm is fantastic because you can get the whole building in with some room on the top, whereas with the 17mm, same distance, you can't do that. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the 15mm can be extremely useful for a lot of photographers. And when you shift all the way up, there is a bit of vignetting on both lenses, and both lenses do lose some detail. But I think, you know, a lot of architectural photographers tend to expect this from tilt shift or shift lenses. Also, once again, color differences between both of these lenses. You can see how the Laowa is leaning a little bit more orange. whereas the Canon is more accurate. And you know, some of you may prefer the look of the Laowa over here because of that warmer tone, but I prefer a more neutral color, a more accurate color, because when you're looking at the brickwork on the floor over here, this is not supposed to be orange. This is supposed to be more of the pinky reddish color that it is over here on the Canon image, and the Laowa it isn't representing it correctly. So it can cause problems for color accuracy, and for those of you who are shooting buildings or doing interior design and such like that, then when color becomes important, the Laowa may not be the perfect choice. Finally, I did a full horizontal shift panorama, and you can see how the Laowa does get quite a bit more in the frame. And the Laowa in flat lighting conditions, very, very sharp lens, picks up a great deal of detail. Colors might be a little bit off, but this is a fantastic bit of gear when it comes to the detail that it picks up. Even right to the edges, the Laowa is noticeably sharper. Like, it does lose a little bit of detail, but compared to the Canon, not as much. Like, it is a sharper lens in comparison to the Canon. Even if you move on to this side, you can see how the brickwork is just a little bit crisper on the Laowa than it is on the Canon. Is it a huge difference? I mean, I wouldn't say it's massive, but for those of you who want the best in optical performance when it comes to sharpness and detail, the Laowa does perform. However, this is only in flat lighting conditions, and I'm finding that in harsher lighting conditions, when you have direct sunlight, or when you have any tricky scenarios, or when it comes to color, the Laowa is a little bit of a temperamental lens. It's not as consistent in its performance as the Canon 17 is. Now, it's no secret that I'm a big fan of Laowa and the products that they produce. They have some of the most interesting and most quirky lenses on the market, and they're pretty much a breath of fresh air in the industry. They're really one of the most innovative companies that I've come to know. And a few years ago, I was speaking to Mr. Lee from Laowa, and I was talking about why they should produce a shift lens or a tilt shift lens. And I described how it doesn't need to have tilting features, it doesn't need to have the widest aperture, it just needs to have good quality optics. And I'm really pleased to see this lens finally on the market. So it's incredible how Laowa have been able to produce such a good lens, because optically speaking, when it comes to sharpness and detail, edge to edge, this lens is fantastic. But one of the things that Mr. Lee mentioned has really stuck with me, and he said that the biggest innovation within the optics industry or within the lens design industry is lens coatings. And it's these coatings that are extremely expensive and one of the best things that people have innovated. And I think that's what's lacking on the 15 shift lens from Laowa. I mean, coatings are expensive, and I think that if they applied it on the lens, then it would have shot up the price by quite a significant amount. But I think that's the thing that's really dropping the performance down on this particular lens, because the internal reflections, the flaring, all of those things are hammering the performance. And potentially this is a incredible lens across the frame, but it's those internal reflections when you're shooting in bright conditions or direct sunlight, it really causes a lot of problems, as you saw. And this is one of the reasons why I'm finding it difficult to recommend this lens to everyone who's an architectural photographer. I think that for professionals, you may want something which is a little less temperamental, a little bit more reliable. And for me personally, the 17 tilt shift is doing a fine job. So I think I'm going to stick with the 17 tilt shift. For a lot of professionals, maybe they might choose that as well. I don't know. I just think that a more reliable lens which works in a greater number of tougher, challenging conditions is probably a better option. Having said that, the 15 shift lens is a brilliant lens. It really is. And for those of you who need that wider field of view, this is the widest shift lens on the market. And honestly, it's freaking brilliant. Anyway, just want to say thank you so much for watching our video. If you like this video, hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video. Make sure you check out our store on the website as well, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you.